Hey gang, alright. I want to go over really briefly women in politics and a couple of the sort of key issues that might not be completely obvious by the PowerPoint, some of the things that are maybe a little more involved or complicated. Um, a little bit of background or where we're starting from here. When we talk about women in politics, we're talking about the sort of legal place of women, the economic and social place of women in society, and women's ability to access um, civil society, their ability to access public life, if that makes sense. Um, there, we talked a little bit about people having legitimacy, sort of automatically assumed legitimacy with citizenship. People are assumed to be citizens, and some people are assumed not to be citizens. Some people have to prove that they have a right to be there, to be somewhere in a public space, whereas other people are just assumed to have the right to be in a situation or in a specific place in public. What we're looking at here are why sort of women's political issues are something, separate and special to look at is because of our long history of sexism has created a situation where women are often boxed out from being able to fully participate in civil society and those things that make somebody a sort of full and equal citizen in the country. Join various social groups, have jobs, be able to be comfortable in jobs, be able to go outside at night and not get harassed, be able to make as much money as somebody else, as a man, things like that. Okay, so I think we all have maybe some idea that things have changed in terms of the legal place and political place of women in Western society over the years. Some people probably have an idea that way back in the day, hundreds of years ago, it was really awful. Today, it's a lot better. True, yes. So, just a little bit of how things evolved. Up until the 1970s, okay, up until the 1970s, there were some aspects of this legal tradition still in effect, but it wasn't completely into effect in all aspects, right? But here's the historical legal place of women. So let's go back to let's just go back to like the 11, 12, 1300s and continue to the late 1800s. When a woman gets married to a man, the woman disappears as a legal entity. All right, so have you heard of marriage as a union between a man and a woman? Right? Well, what this means is that, quite literally, there was one man and there was one woman. Now, there's no longer one man and one woman. There's one person. They're no longer separate from each other. Of course, you still need to have somebody who's the head who can speak for that one entity, and who would it always happen to be? The man. So the woman legally would completely disappear and become an extension of / the property of the man she married. This explains a lot about why historically, legally, things like rape were considered crimes against either the father if the woman was not married, or the husband if the woman was married. Why up until recently, like we're talking the last 4 decades, a man could legally rape his wife, because it wasn't considered rape, because the sort of question there would be, how can you rape yourself if according to the law there is only one person there can't be an issue of consent, right? Just it's the way it is. A lot has changed. We'll talk about some of this and the effects of it today in a moment. But I want to talk a little bit about women in the workplace, specifically things like wage discrimination and how historical sexism and work segregation has actually created situations today where certain professions are paid less than other professions, if that makes sense. So here's what I mean. First, women have always worked. One, raising a child is work. Running a household is work. But this sort of idea we have in our heads of, the woman staying at home and cooking for the husband, and the husband comes home, has a martini, smokes a cigar, and reads GQ or something. This is a very kind of upper class white view of how the family structure has been throughout American history. It doesn't take into account the fact that there were more Americans who were poor, and both the man and the woman had to work in the world and make money to support the family. One of the interesting legal twists with the fact that the man and the woman were the same legal entity was that any wages the woman earned, the man actually earned. Because if you're married, if you're a man and a woman and you're married, if you're a woman, you do not exist legally. You're not a person anymore. Like, you become invisible. You die once you get married. So, how can a dead person make money? They can't. So, any wages that a woman makes would go to the man. This is also why men were allowed to provide reasonable corrective measures for a very long time legally, meaning beat their wife. Because if the wife's, occasionally for some crimes, if the wife committed some crimes, the man could actually be held responsible for them. There would be the lower level offenses, maybe, stealing something, or trespassing, or, I don't know, and some other, kind of dumb laws. Let's say the cars were in existence in the 1800s and before, speeding. The woman wouldn't get the ticket because the woman doesn't exist. The man would get the ticket, and the man would have to pay it, and to make sure that the woman stayed in line so that the man wouldn't have to pay for his woman's, badness, he would be able to beat her, much like, well, let's just leave it there. He would be able to beat her. Now, conveniently, if the woman murdered somebody or committed treason, the law all of a sudden found that the woman was a independent legal entity, and thus the woman would be held culpable for the crimes and not the man. Very convenient for men, right? Okay, so we got women in work. Women have worked, and their wages are actually a man's wages. In the mid to late 1800s, it became more and more acceptable for women to start working outside of the home as like, oh, you know, you have a job outside of the home. That doesn't mean automatically that you're poor, uncivilized, worthless piece of crap. However, the jobs women could have were somehow related to the woman's, what people consider the woman's natural sphere, domestic sphere, sort of the area that they occupied in American life. These would be nurturing fields, nurses, teachers, daycare operators, sewing, because sewing is housework and nurturing and stuff, secretaries. If you're the head of a household, you do some secretaries type stuff. So women would enter the workplace, would start getting jobs in these fields. Now, women's income was always seen as secondary to a man's income. And what I mean by this is a woman's income was never seen as being necessary to a household. The man was the only person that legitimately was able to work. If the woman worked, that was kind of a nice side hobby for her. Because it was only a nice side hobby and it didn't have to pay enough to support a family, unlike the man's income, women were paid less because nobody saw there be a reason to pay the woman the same amount as a man. So take that little nugget there, okay? Now remember the second part. Teachers, secretaries, they call them spinstresses now, clothing, textile people, whatever. Secretaries, I think I said that already, nurses, women's work. These people don't need to be paid as much, like I said, because they're not trying to support a family on it, because, no woman is without a man, of course. So here's the tricky thing about that, or here's what happened. Teachers, nurses, all these people got paid crap in the 1800s and early 1900s. This has set the precedent for what we expect these people to earn that carries forward to today. I assume everybody in the class in some form or another agrees that teachers across America are paid kind of crap wages. Secretaries don't make as much money. Right? Kind of. We all know this maybe a little bit. Teachers have a crap ton of responsibilities. The average teacher makes 1,500 executive independent decisions every single day. They have to think on the fly all the time. These are like CEO level, needing to sort of keep control of a big organization, making all these important decisions that can affect the outcome of so many people, right? And to be a teacher, you need an education. Minimum bachelor's degree. Lots of teachers have master's degree and still don't get paid a lot of money. A lot of teachers have PhDs and still also don't get paid a lot of money. The reason why we accept this situation when we would not accept somebody with a similar level of responsibility and education to make this little money, this little amount of money, is because we have come to expect that teachers will just get paid shit. And the reason why is because we all have always learned that teachers don't get paid a lot because it was connected to a woman's work. It was a woman's job. So historically, the wages have always been low. As we move forward in time, the wages stay low even as men come into the field. Same thing with secretaries. Secretary is not an easy job. It requires a lot of skill, a lot of decision making, judgment calls, a a lot of good common sense, which a lot of people don't have. The ability to, understand lots of different functions of an organization and being able to navigate all those different functions of the organization, which the only other people who are required to do things like that are, again, let me say, the heads of the organizations. They get paid what, like a good secretary might get, or a well-paid secretary might get, let's say in Greensboro or something like $50,000 or $60,000 a year, something like that. If secretaries and teachers had been historically man's work, and doctors and lawyers had historically been woman's work, doctors and lawyers would get paid about as much as teachers do, and teachers and secretaries would get paid about as much as doctors and lawyers do today. This has nothing to do with the free market supply and demand of labor, what's in, demand, how few people there are out there to do a job, things like that. This is pure sexism in our society has created the situation where certain people in certain professions get paid less than other professions, despite the fact that one profession might have a lot more responsibility, educational requirements, things like that. Less people might be able to do the job than the profession down here, than the other profession that gets paid a lot more. Okay, that's the way sexism has, in the past, has created situations. Today, a lot of these fields are still dominated by women. There has been, it seems, some movement making it so that nurses are getting paid better, but that's been a very recent development, and there's been a lot of work towards doing that. So that's good for nurses. But when we have a situation where work is segregated, sexually segregated, we have sex segregated work already, and historically the amount we pay people, if we pay them a good wage, is based upon their genitalia. That's why women get paid less. We have more women in poverty. We have single moms are in poverty at a lot higher rates than single dads. Women are considered worthy of less pay because of some of these other stereotypes that might get into right now, actually. If you read your Delusions of Gender reading, there's lots of very, very good studies in there that help give you like rock solid statistical evidence about how sexism in society works. It's works through the system. I think in one of the chapters I gave you Caroline Fine. How do you pronounce her name? I probably won't be able to pronounce it despite looking at it. Cordyline? Her name right there. There's a section where she says, and I think this is very important to pull out, as sort of a general comment also, anecdote is not evidence. Anecdotes can be used to illustrate, provide context to evidence, but they're not evidence of something. Now, what I mean by an anecdote, or anecdotal evidence is what they sometimes call it, a story, a specific event that happened. Let's just take the McKinney, the Texas pool thing. That incident by itself is in no way evidence that racism existed in America. All that is a single event, one story. It's evidence of nothing other than evidence that that happened. That's all you can say about it by itself. However, when you add in some of the studies that I've provided about how Black Americans are sort of automatically connected with more dangerous objects, Black Americans are less likely to get jobs, seen as less worthy of jobs. Black Americans and especially black children, are seen as not experiencing pain as much as white children. They're less susceptible to it. Somehow they're less civilized, more savage, tougher, and thus you need to treat them tougher to get them to comply. The statistical evidence, the evidence clearly shows that as being widespread and true. You can take that evidence, all right? Take those studies, take that clear evidence that shows a widespread problem, and then say, look at what happened in McKinley, Texas. Look at the way the officer threw that 14-year-old girl around. The reason, this is what we're talking about when we say that white people in America view black people as somehow, again, less susceptible to pain, that it takes more to bring them down, that they're just sort of inherently less inclined to listen to orders. There's a reason why the officer pulled out a gun as some other children got near him. Some of the black children got near him, whereas white people that got near him, he did not do that. We can explain all that. We can use that story to illustrate, to provide an example of this evidence, of the statistical evidence, of the sort of real proof, if that makes sense. So you can, if you're writing a paper, you'll be like, Americans think this, this, and this, white American has these bias. For example, a good illustration of this is what happened at this pool party. This is how this is how the police treated this 14 or 15-year-old black girl at the party. This is a great illustration of how this type of racism plays itself out. This is what that looks like in real life. Okay. Why did I go off on all that? Because it was important. Oh, it was about, I wanted to talk about the studies with women. Oh yeah, so that was a point that she made in here that was really important. A lot of the studies that we have with women and how there's sexism and how we can have evidence of sexism with women are the same as they are with all different races. So I think at the very beginning of the first section that I gave y'all, she goes through various studies. Pretty sure it's in this section. I was just reading the rest of the book earlier again. Okay, so that's the glass workplace. Section premature speculation, I think, is the chapter. Yeah. Okay. It's already here, I feel like. $31. This is fascinating. YouTubing. 32. Okay, here's an example. This is on page 132 in the reading. As an empirical endeavor, the neuroscience of sex differences began in earnest in the mid-19th century. The findings of Victorian scientists and medical men of the day were, quote, a key source of opposition, end quote, to women's suffrage and equal access to higher education, notes Yale University historian of science Cynthia Rousset. Certainly, as she documents, they improved on the ideas of their predecessors who presented evidence to argue, for example, that women's intellectual inferiority compared with white men could be seen in the angles of their faces. As asserted by the late 18th century experts on the measurement of facial verticality, the idea of stupidity is associated even by the vulgar with the elongation of the snout, which necessarily lowers the facial line. Women did not fare well in such assessments and were reported to share with the primitive and savage races an unfortunate lack of facial verticality. Good job. It was not long though, before this crude measure was jettisoned in favor of a more sophisticated Cephical index, namely the skull brain area, namely the ratio of the skull length to skull breadth. The index was for a while thought to be a promising indicator of mental capacity, but was reluctantly abandoned when it became clear that the head shapes of inferior social groups, including women, did not segregate neatly from those of superior groups. Alright, so why did I read that? Because this right here is evidence or previous studies that have been done where essentially people are coming to the conclusion women are stupid, inferior, blah, 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 and trying to find some way to justify it. Once the angle of the face measure was shown to be not true, people tried to find another reason why women were inferior. They went with the head. At one point, people went with the size of the femur bone as the reason why women were inferior. Of course, all those fell down because none of the things ended up holding weight over time. However, from all this, we still today have this idea that scientifically we've proven that women are nurturing, docile, loving, caring, not violent. If you heard the phrase, if women rule the world, there would be no war, blah, blah, blah. Please. We see people have been saying that for hundreds of years and still no evidence for it. So that's a place to start with understanding where sort of sexism comes today. Now, some of the money stuff, all right, job stuff. Slide 6, implicit unconscious barriers. Women are just paid less than men. That sucks. We have studies for this, and it's the same with both the studies we talked about with race and chances of getting a job, and here with gender and chances of getting a job. They're both sort of in the lab experiments and in the real world experiments. So in the lab experiments are a resume is sent out to or in the lab, a resume is given to a bunch of students in a certain class, and they're asked to rate which person is more qualified for a job, Michelle or Michael. Or a bunch of business experts are brought into a room and said, hypothetically, for this job, if you were to hire somebody, who would you hire? How would you rate the highest applicant, Michelle or Michael? Michael would always be rated higher. That would be lab, so you're in kind of an artificial controlled setting. In real world, they find real advertisements for real jobs, send out resumes to the real jobs where they're really reviewed by HR departments and by the people who are hiring, and they sit back and they see if Michael or Michelle gets more callbacks. So cool. Michael gets more callbacks. Michael is always seen as being worthy of more money because Michael is more committed to the work. He is smarter, the exact same, like they both have a bachelor's degree in political science and they both have 4.0s. Michael's bachelor's degree in 4.0 political science, whatever, is seen as being somehow evidence that he's still smarter than Michelle. There's that. There's studies that, again, this isn't something that sort of stays with, you know, the sexist madman world of corporate America or, you know, rural bumpkin town USA. Liberal bastions of academia, people looking at professors rating other professors for tenure track positions will rate women as being less capable, or they'll view women as being with more skepticism as being qualified for a job. There's an example about the tenure track in here, whereas something like 80% or something of the Michael were recommended for hire for this tenure track job, whereas, you know, I'm making up the names that were associated with it. Michelle, with the exact same CV, was recommended 47% of the time. However, also with Michelle's CV were notes saying, I'd want to confirm that she earned this herself. Or, you know, I'd want to double check and read this publication to see if it's actually any good. Whereas Michael would just be like, oh, look, he did it all himself, and it was accepted to a journal, so it's just good, and that's just the end of it. A really interesting study was the executive secretary versus executive chief of staff. People got a job that said, or an application, they got a job announcement for an executive secretary, okay? And it had a list of what the duties of an executive secretary are. So you gotta handle phone calls, you gotta coordinate meetings, you gotta take notes at meetings, you've gotta send out memos and birthday announcements or something like that, I don't know. When the title of the job was executive secretary, the women were rated as better suited for the job, but also worthy of less money, if I remember correctly. Whereas when the job was called executive chief of staff, the exact same job with the exact same duties, men were rated as more worthy of that job. And when people looked at those jobs on a resume, so you'd have a resume where the man would say, I was an executive chief of staff and I had these duties, do you want to hire me? A woman would say, I was an executive secretary, I had these exact same duties, do you want to hire me? People would look at the executive chief of staff job as being better than the executive secretary job, because secretary is associated with women, chief of staff is associated with powerful men. I talked about in class the study about the police chief job, where if a man and woman were up for a police chief job as a police chief, people are asked to rate what are you looking for in a police chief. All right, you would have two resumes in front of you, both would be identical except for maybe, let's say in this first case, the woman's resume had more experience but less education. The man's resume had more education but less experience. In that instance, people rated education as being more important to being a police chief than experience. All right, now the man had the more education in this case, and the woman had less education. Now, if you flip that, the woman has more education but less experience. The man has more experience but less education. In those resumes, people rated experience as being more important to the job of a police chief than education. The explanation for this is because people looked at the resumes, saw that one was a man, one was a woman, and just sort of that triggered in their mind this automatic assumption that the man is better for this job, therefore what the man has, the experiences the man has, is what is required for the job. People weren't coming at it with this independent, objective idea of this is what we need in a police chief. They were coming at it, looking at the resumes, seeing what the man had, and then saying that's what we need in a police chief. Okay, and about women being full participants in society and things like that. This is the reason why Violence Against Women Act, this fighting against rape culture, sexual harassment in the workplace, things like this are taken so seriously and are sort of require different special legislation, a sort of different public policy take on it to try and solve some of these problems, because sexual violence against women has been used for centuries as a way to make women feel not safe and as a way to keep them out of the workplace, keep them out of the social sphere, to control them, to allow men to control them at home and things like that. I talked about in class my fiance getting gas at 9:30, 10:30, something like that at night. One of the few times she's gone out at night by herself in the past several years. 5 guys walk up to her and start going, "Hey, sweetheart, how's it going?" "It's going okay." "What are you doing out here all by your lonesome, sweetheart?" "I'm pumping gas." "Well, I mean, yeah, but, what are you doing all alone? Somebody, who looks as good as you shouldn't be alone." "Well, my fiance's waiting on me at home." "Oh, okay." And then they leave. That's intimidating. That's a little scary. I think 5 people coming up to anybody and starting to ask if they're alone and what they're doing out at night by themselves is a little weird. But add with it all the historical oppression, the sort of social meaning behind actions like that. Men have this idea that they have a right to women's bodies, to control women's bodies, that men feel like they have a right to talk to women like that, to harass them on the street. That same day, I was running around the neighborhood, running back to the house, way back from my run. A woman was walking about, let's say, 100 feet in front of me. So as I'm running, towards her. I'm going to pass her at some point. This car comes down, slows down right next to her, practically stops to keep parallel with her while she's walking. And the guy in the car rolls down the window and hollers at her. "You got a nice ass, baby." Stays with her for a minute, and then she's like, "Get the hell away from me," and he has to drive off. Women should not be subjected to that crap. Just going outside of their home. They should be able to walk down the street without a man feeling like he has the right to harass them, to make them feel uncomfortable, to make them not feel safe. This whole culture that we live in where that stuff is allowed, where it's seen as being okay, or at the very least it's seen as being, well, it might not be the best thing in the world, but a man's gonna be what a man's gonna be, or whatever. That whole system has been set up as an explicit way to keep women out of social life, to keep them out of civil society, to keep them out of having jobs, being able to participate as a full citizen in a democratic society. This is the sort of situation, or this is the soup that those actions exist in. Next time anybody feels like hollering at a woman who's just walking down the street minding her own business, you might want to think that, hey, the action I'm about to do is part of this overall sexist system that is designed to make women not feel safe being in the world around them, to go out by themselves, to prevent them from having full agency in society. So maybe don't do that. You don't have a right to do that stuff. Okay. What was next on there? Kind of look like a serial killer sometimes when I smile. That's what everybody says. Okay, yeah. So that's why some of these violence against women acts, these specific women-related laws need to be addressed, or need to be passed, or are even considered, because the idea is, again here, just like race, a sex-based discrimination needs to be directly addressed with sex-based solutions or sex-based laws. Why is rape not just a crime because it's rape? Why does it have to be covered under this extra Violence Against Women Act? Well, it's because rape has served a specific political purpose over time as a means to control women, to intimidate women, to prevent them from sort of being out in the public sphere, from holding office, whatever, because they've been taught and people have decided to constantly make them in fear of that. There's some statistics on here about sexual violence against women. At least 1 in 5 women will be the victim of a rape or an attempted rape. Very few of them are ever reported. There's this backlash to the attempt to make rape sort of a more easier crime to prosecute, or something that's given sort of more serious attention. The backlash has been that women falsely report rape to get back at men, and if men are falsely accused of rape, then that ruins their lives, blah, blah, blah. The fact of the matter, though, is that rape is reported falsely reported at the same level as any other crime. So the same percentage of people that report their car stolen is roughly the same percentage of people who say they were raped but really were not raped. Does that make sense? So my sort of point here is that there's not this epidemic that people are worried about, that people say there is going on and they should be worried about. That's a common counter argument. You'll get to some of this stuff. Very few rapists ever see jail time. It's very sad. There's some good specific case studies in here, or examples that I encourage you to look at. I think it's still in here. Yeah, in 2012, a North Carolina Supreme Court case said that if a woman consents to sex, during the act of sex, she cannot withdraw that consent. It's not rape. So if I'm a woman and I'm having sex with a man, or with anybody, or I'm just having sex with anybody, no matter what sex I am, if I say at some point during it, no, I don't want to do this anymore, they have the right to continue to do stuff to me, despite the fact that I don't want to do it. At least that's what the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled in 2010. That's a little horrendous, you know. I'm going to put a link on here about tea and consent and sex and stuff. Okay, I'm going to just cut it off there. I've gone way too long. The very last thing I'll just say is that look at the links at the very end of the PowerPoint. There's some articles and a couple of videos there that give sort of concrete examples of some of the things I've talked about. Okay, cool. Thanks. Y'all guys are awesome.